Well, friends, welcome to the lecture tonight. People are still coming in, both in person and online, but I'm glad you could all join us during this season of Advent. And my name is John Martins, the director of the Center for Christian Engagement at St. Mark's College. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is a traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In future events, we are working at the Center for Christian Engagement to hear directly from a number of First Nations voices in order to listen, learn, and to act. It's our goal that the Center for Christian Engagement become a source of healing and reconciliation by examining the past truthfully, accompanying those suffering today compassionately, and acting humbly and wisely as we move forward together. The Center at St. Mark's College emphasizes the importance of listening, reflecting, learning, discussing, and praying as we explore the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition and engage with those who do not share our tradition. And I want to thank our generous donors to the Center, whose generosity does enable this work to take place. Peter Bull, Angus Reed, and Andy Zox. We're thankful for their commitment to the life of the Center and the work of the church in the world. We're also thankful to the Cullen family and for their generous support of these lecture series here at the Center and the colleges in fall 2021 and in winter 2022. We want to create a culture of encounter and dialogue. We're thankful for those of you who are here with us in person tonight and for the many more of you who have joined us online. This evening's lecture, I should say, by Dr. Sarah K. Johnson promises to really set the tone for us in Advent and as we enter into the Christmas season. Really good Christians, they go Easter and Christmas. We're thankful to have Sarah here to offer the lecture and on a topic that's so relevant and that gets at an issue that's been studied and pondered and worried about by many. For some people, this is the growth of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who no longer engage directly with formal or institutionalized religion. But Dr. Johnson's lecture touches on a closely related issue, those people who attend religious meetings sometimes or occasionally. What motivates them? Why do they remain related in some way to these traditions, even if it's not as intense or formal as we used to expect in the past from many people? What do we have to learn from these people? What can they teach us? Dr. Johnson is a practical theologian who studies Christian worship in the context of a changing North American religious landscape, a religious landscape that the Center is here to explore. Her research at the intersection of liturgical studies and sociology of religion employs qualitative methods that value everyday religious experience, commitments to interrogating the relationship between liturgy and ethics, and engaging ecumenically across Christian traditions ground her research, teaching, and church leadership. Dr. Johnson holds a PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame, an MAR in liturgical studies from Yale Divinity School, an MTS from the University of Waterloo, Conrad Grebel University College, and a BA from the University of Waterloo, St. Jerome's University. She's currently a visiting assistant professor of theology and worship and a Louisville Institute postdoctoral fellow, the first in Canada, at St. Mark's College and at Vancouver School of Theology. She's done a lot of work with Mennonite hymnal and worship book, Voices Together, and is the editor of Voices Together Worship Leader Edition in 2020. She's the author of numerous recent journal articles, including On Our Knees, Christian Ritual in Residential Schools, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2018. She's currently co-editing a volume on worship and power in free church traditions. Originally from Waterloo, Ontario, Sarah is affiliated with the Mennonite Church of Canada and served as a pastor in Ottawa. She now lives in Vancouver with her husband, Carl Baer. Please welcome Dr. Sarah K. Johnson.
With a cup of tea, I settle into a corner table at a Starbucks in a Toronto suburb. Maureen arrives a few minutes later for an interview prompted by her grandson's baptism. She has shoulder-length gray-brown hair, glasses, and a colorful scarf tied under the crisp collar of her shirt. Maureen's hands shake a bit as she speaks, but she is eager to share. She describes herself as a history buff and sets the story of her own experience of religion in the context of her Anglican family history and her father's relationship with a particular parish. It is Maureen who spoke the words that inspired the title of tonight's lecture. My dad used to say, "Really good Anglicans, they go Easter and Christmas." According to her own definition, Maureen is not a really good Anglican. Although she had some connection to Presbyterian, United, and Anglican churches in childhood, following a bad experience in marriage preparation, she has had little contact with the church in recent decades. She tried to take her kids a couple of times on Christmas Eve when they were young, and attended once or twice on Easter with her mother, but otherwise has connected only in relation to funerals for her parents, and more recently, for a baptism. Maureen is an occasional practitioner, and she is not alone. I arrive at the Cathedral Church of St. James, the Anglican Cathedral in downtown Toronto, 15 minutes before the 7:30 p.m. Christmas Eve Choral Eucharist is scheduled to begin. This is before COVID-19, and the soaring neo-Gothic space feels full, including overflow chairs set up on either side of the central box pews. It is a striking contrast to any of the 4 liturgies that are celebrated at the cathedral each Sunday. I am not the only one aware of the difference. The bishop begins his homily with an expansive welcome, explicitly welcoming those who are, quote, faithful and doubting, those who are here by choice or by coercion. There is a place for you, he says, although there may not have been a place for you at the 4:30. Suggesting the earlier service was even more crowded. The following year, I attend the 4:30 Christmas Eve lessons and carols at the cathedral. Many seats are filled when I arrive, 45 minutes before the service is scheduled to begin. I slide past an older couple and settle into a pew, about 5 rows from the back. The pew fills quickly. An elementary school-aged child ends up sitting on the lap of a parent at the far end. The family had to split up to find seats. By 4:15, every seat is filled, and worshipers line the walls at the back and the sides. I return to the cathedral later that week, on the Sunday after Christmas. The chancel is still adorned with gold paraments and an abundance of red poinsettias. Many of the same familiar Christmas carols are included in the service. However, in a stark juxtaposition to 4 days earlier, there are 6 empty pews in front of me, 6 empty pews behind me, and only a couple of people in the same section across the center aisle. The contrast is striking. Although these services took place at the cathedral, participant observation, interviews with clergy, diocesan statistics, and common knowledge suggest they represent patterns across Anglican parishes in Toronto. Quantitative data indicates these patterns are widespread in Canada. International comparison points to parallels in the United States and Europe. Perhaps this resonates with your experience here in Vancouver, or in the places where you're joining in online. Despite the prevalence of occasional religious practice, very little research has been done with occasional practitioners. What is the nature and role of Christian worship in a North American religious landscape characterized by declining participation in religious institutions, increasing uncertainty about matters of faith, and a growing proportion of the population who identify as non-religious? How can communities worship in ways that honor the experience of participants who relate to religion in different ways? I introduce and develop the concept of occasional religious practice, drawing on 3 years of ethnographic research in the Anglican tradition in Toronto, including 61 interviews. I am very grateful to the clergy and participants who supported this research. It would not have been possible without them. What I am calling occasional religious practice is a way of relating to religion that is defined by occasional participation in religious practices, attending religious services occasionally rather than routinely, and usually in association with specific occasions. Occasional religious practice is defined in contrast to routine religious practice. There are also those who are more intensive in their practice, and there is the possibility of never participating in religious practices. These are relative categories that are defined contextually and may change over time. 4 types of occasions are associated with occasional religious practice: holidays, life transitions, crises, and incidental circumstances. Holidays are important to occasional practitioners. Christmas and Easter are mentioned with remarkable consistency in interviews. Some parishes even shape their communications with holiday occasional practitioners in mind. One congregation listed the Holy Week and Easter worship schedule on a newsletter distributed on Christmas Eve. Another actively advertised an upcoming Mother's Day brunch on Easter Sunday. Life transitions are also central for many occasional practitioners, including birth, marriage, and death. This last quote from an interview with a godmother is one of my favorites. "My fiancé has said he does not like going to church, so unless it was a baptism, I probably wouldn't have got him there. Are there other occasions when he would attend?" I ask. "Well, we're getting married next week, so he'll have to go." Times of personal or communal crisis are another occasion for religious practice. Crisis may intersect with life transition. It may also involve natural or human-caused disasters, medical diagnoses or accidents, or more subtle struggles. Finally, incidental circumstances such as attending evensong as a tourist or providing transportation to an aging parent may be occasions for religious practice. Participation in corporate worship is the most obvious form of occasional religiosity and is the focus of this study. However, participation in any recognizably religious practice would qualify. The concept of occasional religiosity is anchored in definitions of religion that prioritize practice, such as theories proposed by Martin Riesbrot and Christian Smith. Religion in this context is not about affiliation, belief, or function. It is about observable participation in a meaningful system of concrete, institutionally or culturally prescribed practices. Occasional practitioners can be considered occasionally religious, regardless of their affiliation, their beliefs, their reasons for practicing, or their attitudes and experiences while practicing. And they are extremely diverse in all of these ways. As I mentioned, I interviewed Maureen in connection with her grandson's baptism. Her grandson's mother, Maureen's daughter-in-law, Dora, comes from a small Roman Catholic town in Bavaria, where religion is woven into daily life. Her German accent lilting over her baby's coos and cries, Dora describes photos and the baptism candle that she still has from her baptism in the local Catholic parish. It is also where she received her first communion, served as an altar girl, and was confirmed before leaving her hometown for university, traveling the world, and eventually ending up in Toronto. Dora has never connected with another Christian community, Catholic or otherwise. But when her son is born, there is no question in her mind that she will return to her hometown to baptize him in her home parish, giving her child a connection to her family, culture, homeland, and faith. At the same time, Dora wants to connect her Canadian family-in-law to this event. It is especially important for her that her sister-in-law, Danielle, Maureen's daughter, serves as godmother. However, the Catholic priest in Dora's home parish requires godparents to be baptized. Maureen, because of her bad experience in marriage preparation, did not baptize Danielle as an infant in a local congregation. However, she did baptize her at home with water in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. There is, of course, no formal record of this baptism. In order to serve as a godmother to her nephew, at his Roman Catholic baptism in Bavaria, Danielle decides to pursue baptism as an adult in a local Anglican parish in Toronto, the parish where her grandmother was buried and her mother was married. Based on these connections, Maureen nervously reaches out on Danielle's behalf. The entire family meets with the priest and receives an understanding and compassionate response. In addition to their gratitude that the priest was open to accommodating their unique circumstance, Maureen, Danielle, and Dora are delighted by the progressive theology of the Anglican parish, especially its vocal affirmation of the LGBTQ+ community and its leadership by priests who are women. Even Dora expresses that it is more resonant with her values than her Roman Catholic parish of origin. Yet this adult baptism was never about theological conviction or routine practice. When Danielle is baptized during a Sunday morning liturgy, the priest introduces her to the community and explains, she is doing it for love. Although this story is distinct, there are many parallels to other families who were part of this research, particularly in terms of occasionally religious parents who identify as Roman Catholic, choosing to baptize their children in the Anglican tradition. Participants in this research describe their religious identities in many different ways. All of them are present at Anglican baptisms or funerals, among other occasions for Christian worship. Now, of course, some participants in Anglican practices do identify as Anglican, whether because of past or present belief and practice, or cultural heritage and family background, or personal choice. Many participants claim Anglican identity apart from routine practice. This is the case for Maureen's father, the one who said, really good Anglicans, they go Easter and Christmas. Some participants in Anglican practices affiliate with other expressions of Christianity, such as Roman Catholicism, and understand their religious identities in a similar range of ways. Dora, for example, restrains a strong sense of Roman Catholic identity that is closely tied to cultural heritage and family background. Some participants identify simply as Christian. Conservative Protestants may identify as Christian as a theological statement. More often, Christian is a primary category of identification among racialized Canadians or a default category among white Canadians. Maureen identifies as Christian as well as spiritual in this default manner. She is a white Canadian who is not affiliated with another religious tradition, and this is part of why she sees herself as Christian. Occasional participants in Christian practices may also identify with non-Christian religious traditions. This is sometimes visible in the worship space. At one Anglican baptism I observed, a turbaned Sikh was enthusiastically serving as the family photographer. Occasional practitioners also claim a range of non-religious identities. They may identify as spiritual, to indicate a sense of spiritual connection in their lives, or to point to participation in alternative spiritual practices, or simply to suggest that they are non-religious, but not anti-religious. Danielle primarily describes herself as spiritual but not religious, although her baptism has made her more willing to identify as Anglican. Danielle's husband, who is strongly non-religious, did not attend her baptism, although he was present at the baptism of his nephew. Like him, some occasional practitioners identify as atheist or agnostic or are indifferent to religion. Attention to occasional religious practice reveals that this is the eclectic mixture of participants in Christian worship in the Anglican tradition in Toronto. In a few weeks, you may attend a Christmas Eve service, or perhaps a wedding or a funeral. Look around you. Consider who might be there with you. With this tremendous diversity present in the room, it is unsurprising that there are diverse motivations for occasional participation. I develop a taxonomy of types of vocational practitioners. These types are associated with situational roles and motivations, not stable identity categories. Occasional practitioners include initiators who bring about a practice. For example, a daughter who plans her mother's funeral, or a grandfather who decides his family is going to church together on Christmas Eve. Initiators may be motivated by cultural heritage, a strong sense of Italian Catholic identity, for instance. They may be motivated by a specific relational connection to a friend, family member, or even a clergy person. Some may be motivated by a desire for spiritual connection, space for reflection, or to express gratitude. For example, Dora, in pursuing the baptism of her newborn son, is strongly motivated by cultural heritage. Danielle initiated her own baptism due to the relational connection to Dora. Maureen baptized Danielle as a baby at home out of a desire for spiritual connection. Initiators may also be invisibly routine, meaning they practice privately but not publicly, and therefore appear occasional. An example of this would be praying with children before bed. Very few of the occasional practitioners I interviewed were invisibly routine. In addition, there are also those who are involuntarily occasional, meaning they desire to practice routinely, but barriers beyond their control prevent them from doing so, such as depending on others for transportation. Occasional practice is not always a choice. In contrast to initiators, some occasional practitioners are supporters. Advocates encourage occasional practice without being in the position to initiate it. For example, a grandparent who advocates for the baptism of a grandchild. Inner circle supporters may have central roles, such as making faith commitments alongside a partner on behalf of their child, or offering a eulogy, despite having little personal investment in the practice. Outer circle supporters tend not to have leadership responsibilities, like a coworker or a second cousin who attends a funeral. Dora's mother in Germany is an example of an advocate. She is very invested in this baptism taking place, although she is not in the position to initiate it. As godmother, Danielle is an inner circle supporter in the context of her nephew's baptism. In this case, making commitments in a language she does not speak, in the Catholic tradition she does not practice. Dora's vast extended family could be considered outer circle supporters. Catalysts include the infant being baptized and the deceased. They bring about the practice, but can neither directly initiate nor support it. Dora's baby is the catalyst behind his own baptism, and to some extent, Danielle's baptism as well. Occasional practice is shaped by complex motivations and circumstances. These motivations are personal and social, spiritual and cultural, although these dimensions of human experience are often difficult to differentiate. Each type of occasional practice is valid. None of these types of occasional religiosity can be easily dismissed. These practices are meaningful and purposeful for participants. It is inaccurate and unhelpful to assume that legitimate religious practice consists primarily of individual cognitive assent and routine or intensive participation. Occasional practice, in its diversity, is a significant and very ordinary way of relating to religion. Perhaps you see yourself in some of these categories, in certain situations or at certain times in your life. Perhaps this provides language to name people you know, a partner, a parent, a child, a friend. Although it is not a new phenomenon, occasional religiosity is widespread in contemporary contexts. What I am calling occasional religious practice is a common thread that runs through literature on religious change in Canada, the United Kingdom, Europe, the United States, and Australia. For example, based on national survey data, Reginald Bibby claims 44% of Canadians are low religious, those in the religious middle, who neither embrace nor reject religion. Bibby describes this population primarily in terms of occasional ritual participation. The so-called low religious are the dominant group in every region, age, and gender category. Brian Clark and Stuart MacDonald likewise observe this pattern in their quantitative study of religious change in Canada since 1945. They use the term soft de-churched to describe those who identify with a Christian tradition and attend occasional rather than ordinary church services. We see a similar religious middle in the 2017 study conducted by the Angus Reid Institute. Two groups they describe as spiritually uncertain and privately faithful attend religious services rarely or a few times a year. These groups compose more than half the population. The religious divides in Canada and beyond are not only among those who affiliate with different religious traditions or who are aligned with more conservative or progressive religious positions. They are also among those who have different relationships with religious practices. One striking example of this realignment is a new religious typology from the Pew Research Institute in the United States. Instead of categorizing Americans by religious affiliation, it identifies three groups: the highly religious, somewhat religious, and non-religious. Each of these analyses of the contemporary religious landscape points to a complex religious middle ground. While there are certainly those at the extremes of religion and non-religion, many more Canadians exist somewhere in between. Occasional practice is an important characteristic of this middle ground, although some occasional practitioners can also be found at the edges. In this literature, occasional religious practice is usually grouped with other measures and markers of religion, such as affiliation and belief, to create broader categories. Examining occasional practice in its own right contributes to this conversation in numerous ways, three of which I highlight today. First, a focus on occasional practice, apart from other dimensions of religion, reveals the internal diversity of occasional practitioners. Not all occasional practitioners are vicariously religious or nominally religious or non-religious, but it is likely that some relate to religion in each of these ways. A close look at occasional practice provides a crucial window into the diversity that is present when religious practices are taking place. Second, occasional religious practice aspires to be value-neutral terminology. It aims to avoid presenting occasional religiosity as somehow irregular, low, fuzzy, fringe, or marginal. It aims to avoid language that is critical of occasional practitioners, dismissing this way of relating to religion as nominal, cultural, or soft. This theory aspires to honor occasional religious practice as a valid and substantial way of being religious. It aims to acknowledge and engage occasional religiosity as a phenomenon in itself, on its own terms. Third, occasional religious practice invites dialogue. Echoing long-standing patterns of interreligious and ecumenical dialogue, those who relate to religious practices in different ways can learn from one another while remaining firmly anchored in their own forms of practice. In addition, we can come to better understand our own practice through encounter with those who relate to religion differently. In a setting like this, when you have shown up for a lecture about religion on a Friday night, I would like to emphasize especially the potential for routine and intensive practitioners, including clergy and academic theologians such as myself, to learn through encounter and dialogue with occasional practitioners. This is not simply a sociological question. It is a theological one. Dialogue with occasional religious practitioners is possible and necessary for understanding Christian worship and doing liturgical theology today. In many cases, a crucial starting point for dialogue is shifting attitudes toward occasional religious practice. Occasional practitioners are rarely taken seriously in the church or the theological academy. When noticed, they may be the butt of jokes. These kind of jokes contain a grain of truth, but also reflect the hostile and dismissive attitudes of some routine practitioners and church leaders. Occasional practitioners are often viewed as irrelevant, disparaged as lesser Christians, or fetishized as a target for evangelistic efforts. The liturgical experience and theological expressions of occasional practitioners have rarely been valued in the church or in academic theology as providing important perspectives on Christian faith, life, and liturgy. But this can change. Alternative ways of thinking theologically about occasional practice can anchor a shift in attitude toward occasional practitioners. Tomáš Halík is a Czech Roman Catholic priest and theologian who served as an advisor to the Pontifical Council for Dialogue with Non-Believers and is a winner of the Templeton Prize. One of his English books is a popular volume titled Patience with God, the story of Zacchaeus continuing in us. In it, Halík invites us into the story of Zacchaeus, found in the Gospel according to Luke. Zacchaeus is a wealthy tax collector in the city of Jericho. When Jesus passes through the city, crowds gather around him. Zacchaeus climbs a tree to get a look at Jesus. Jesus sees Zacchaeus, calls him by name, and invites himself over to his house. Halík uses the story of Zacchaeus to consider Jesus' attention to those who Halík refers to as on the fringes of faith, those who are curious seekers, but at the same time want to maintain a certain distance. Halík describes how to follow Jesus is to have a prior interest in people on the fringes of faith, a prior interest in those who remain in the anteroom of the church, those who are in the gray zone between religious certainty and atheism, those who are doubters and seekers. However, this prior interest is not a missionary interest, a desire to convert or to bring more certainty. Halík wants to honor the way Zacchaeus relate to religion rather than trying to change it. He feels concern for them and wants to ensure that they are not manipulated. We have to learn to create space for the Zacchaeuses, including those who will never become standard parishioners, or at least respect the space they create around themselves. Halík then goes a step further and suggests dialogue with those on the fringes of faith is an opportunity for mutual learning. Our closeness to the seekers ought also to teach us openness. We don't have to solely think about having to teach and edify them. We can also learn a great deal from them. And we can try to show those people in the church who are self-assured and satiated about their religion that it is necessary, at least sometimes, to reach out to people on the fringes of the churches, and not just to convert and assimilate them. Being able to look at how God appears from the standpoint of people who are searching, doubting, and questioning, isn't this a new, exciting, necessary, and useful religious experience? Halík's reading of the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus can anchor dialogue with occasional practitioners, particularly through his openness to learning from those who are not standard parishioners. My approach to occasional practice develops Halík's theology in two new directions. First, Halík's account is quite narrowly centered on matters of belief, particularly atheism and the question of God. I am more interested in religion as practice and how practice itself can serve as a starting point for dialogue and even a form of dialogue. Second, attention to occasional religious practice reveals that not all occasional practitioners are seekers. Some identify as committed Christians, and others are firmly non-religious. Most who I speak with are very content with their current relationship with religion. They are not seeking something different. However, a significant contribution of Halík's account is the way he draws on liberation theologies to name Jesus' attention to forms of marginalization that are not economic. Zacchaeus was wealthy and powerful, yet on the fringes of society and the fringes of faith. I too draw inspiration from liberation theologies to emphasize attending to voices on the theological and liturgical margins. Occasional practitioners are a marginalized group in the church, and this must be taken seriously by followers of Jesus concerned with those on the margins, whether those margins are economic, social, theological, or liturgical. At the same time, there is an important distinction from economically focused liberation theologies. Economic liberation has the goal of ending poverty, of changing the identity, status, and material conditions of the poor, as well as the systems that create these conditions. Liberation on the liturgical and theological margins does not aim to change the identity, status, or ways people relate to religion, or the systems that created these realities. It is more akin to liberation theologies that focus on changing how differences are perceived, such as those associated with gender, race, or ability, and with changing the systems that make these differences problematic. In other words, the goal is not to transform occasional religious practitioners into routine practitioners. Instead, the goal is to change attitudes, so the liturgical and theological margins are seen as privileged places of liturgical theological insight, and dialogue can emerge among all liturgical participants. In the final portion of this lecture, I offer a few practical suggestions, first for occasional practitioners, and then for routine and intensive practitioners. For the occasional practitioners who are here tonight, I offer 4 suggestions about how to engage in religious practices on certain occasions. First, know yourself. Know your motivations and expectations. Participants in interviews often expressed gratitude for the opportunity to reflect deeply and honestly on their own religious experiences. The question that began each interview was simply, "Tell me the story of the baptism. Tell me the story of the funeral." One way to approach knowing yourself is to ask a variation of this question. What is the story you would want to tell about the baptism, or about Christmas Eve, or Mother's Day? What is the story you would want to tell about this event? This research can also be a resource for self-reflection in providing ways to name different ways of relating to religious practices. An emphasis on knowing yourself is not intended to apply occasional practice as individualistic or oriented toward personal preference. This relates to the second suggestion. Know your community. The practices at the center of this research are corporate events. Occasional practice is often deeply relational. Motivations for religious practice are intertwined with family and heritage. It is crucial to consider the broader communities connected to the practice. When you are initiating a practice, strive to understand the role of religion in the lives of catalysts and advocates, especially if it differs from your own experience. Attending to inner circle supporters who relate to religion in a diversity of ways is also crucial. Initiators do well to consider the place of religion in the broader community that may be present at the practice, outer circle supporters, and routine practitioners involved in the local congregation. When you are a supporter of a practice, strive to understand the place of religion in the lives of those at the center, initiators, advocates, and catalysts. One simple way to get to know your community is to ask. Ask people to share stories about their experiences of religious practices at different times in their lives. What does your grandmother remember about her wedding ceremony? What are your partner's memories of Catholic school liturgies? Did your uncle celebrate Christmas as a child? What was that like? A third suggestion, know your options. A story. Catherine has a Roman Catholic and Orthodox background, yet has never attended religious services routinely, and now identifies as agnostic. John has a Roman Catholic and Anglican background and was raised in the Anglican tradition. When Catherine and John's first child is born, they initially pursue Catholic baptism. However, the parishes Catherine contacts require godparents to participate in baptismal preparation in person, which is not possible for Catherine's brother who lives in China. Catherine next inquires about baptism at a local Anglican parish and, much to my surprise, reports that they only baptize older children, which is not an acceptable option for her Orthodox extended family, who are anxious for the child to be baptized as soon as possible, just in case. Catherine and John persist and reach out to a historic Anglican parish at a distance from their home, where John's family has a cemetery plot. They receive a generous welcome and the flexibility they require for Catherine's brother to participate. The baptism of their first child in this parish establishes a pattern they follow for their next child, although they switch from the 11 o'clock to the 9 o'clock service, which better suits their toddler's sleep schedule. Although they attend only on the occasion of the baptisms, Catherine and John appreciate the warmth of the clergy, the liturgical space and music, and the celebratory mood. Like Catherine and John, many occasional practitioners have a presumed starting point for pursuing a particular practice. Within a specific parish or religious tradition, various options are often available. At the same time, in most settings, these options are not unlimited. Like Catherine and John, many participants in this research pursue various options in intuitive, creative, and sometimes strategic ways. If participation in a religious practice is a priority for you, do not assume one closed door means all doors are closed. A final suggestion: know that you are not alone. Many occasional practitioners I interviewed feel like they are the only one, that everyone else present is routinely religious. This is not the case. Especially on an occasion like a holiday or a life event, but even on a Sunday morning, other people are also present because of cultural heritage and relationships, or a desire for something more, or to be a good person. These are ordinary and legitimate motivations for religious participation. Occasional practitioners are in good company. Furthermore, know that your experience as an occasional practitioner is valuable for the entire community, including routine and intensive practitioners. I conclude with a few practical suggestions for routine and intensive practitioners, including clergy. But first, I need to acknowledge that the leeway to change practices varies greatly across Christian traditions. Those connected with the United Church have a level of flexibility that is unimaginable to Roman Catholics, for example. However, everyone has the potential to change their attitudes toward occasional practitioners. The attitudes of clergy and other intensive practitioners involved in leadership are especially important because these individuals hold the most power. They have the power to determine what role Christian ritual will play at some of the most important moments in people's lives. In many cases, changing attitudes toward occasional practice can be a starting point for more positive experiences of practicing religion together across difference when the occasion to do so arises. I encourage routine and intensive practitioners to inspire to adopt 3 attitudes toward occasional practice. First, set aside stereotypes about who occasional practitioners are and about what motivates occasional practice. As this research clearly describes, occasional practitioners are diverse, and their religious identities and motivations are diverse. Yet in interviews with me, clergy have presumed that occasional practitioners are all, quote, doing it for grandma, culturally Christian, privately faithful, or spiritual but not religious. Occasional practitioners may be all of these things, or none of these things, among many other possibilities. It is also important to keep in mind that participants connected to the same event may have very different relationships with religion. For example, there may be major differences between partners baptizing a child, or between grandparents and grandchildren attending a funeral. Setting aside assumptions about religious identity and motivation encourages you to encounter each participant as they are and to receive their story on their terms. Second, assume that occasional practitioners are in crisis and respond accordingly. For many participants, occasional practices, including baptisms and funerals, are associated with crises, whether large or small, public or private. We tend to be aware of the element of crisis in relation to funerals, and as a result, lean toward more compassionate responses that accommodate pastoral needs. We seem less aware of the aspects of crisis associated with baptism and marriage, although these are also life-altering events. Over breakfast in a quiet cafe, Greta describes looking for a church where she and her husband could celebrate their legal marriage with a Christian ceremony while expecting their first child. She is an invisibly routine practitioner, and it was very important for her to get married in a church before her child was born. Greta has Catholic and Greek Orthodox heritage and describes being turned away by both traditions. She was heartbroken. This pregnancy followed 4 miscarriages. This context of crisis would have been largely invisible to clergy who could easily dismiss Greta as a bride looking for a wedding venue. But then she encountered a priest who was open to a conversation and able to recognize this young couple in crisis. I spoke to the priest about the 4 that we had lost, and it was almost like she was on the journey with us. She was so empathetic and so kind, and she gave us a prayer blanket, which was completely unexpected and incredibly appreciated. She has certain members of the congregation who make these blankets, and whenever she feels like someone is in need of a little extra prayer, she gives them to them. And that's our first baby blanket. This priest met Greta as a pastor, as a representative of the church community. Greta celebrated her marriage in that congregation, and her 2 children were baptized there. She still attends occasionally. Even holidays may be occasions when emotions are close to the surface, especially in connection with family and grief. Instead of seeing occasional practitioners as a nuisance or distraction from ministry, occasional practice can be approached as an opportunity to connect with individuals and families in crisis and meet them with compassion. Third, I encourage you to approach encounters with occasional practitioners as opportunities for learning as much as teaching. There are some who emphasize occasional practice as an evangelistic occasion, when participants can be taught the Christian faith and brought into the church community. In other words, be converted from occasional to routine practitioners. In contrast, I suggest approaching these occasions as opportunities to hear from often marginalized voices on the prophetic edge of the church, whose experiences shed new light on familiar practices. I could talk for hours about what I have learned in conversation with occasional practitioners, and I have, but today I will simply highlight 3 themes that are deep currents running through these conversations. Christian worship as material more than linguistic, emotional more than conceptual, and relational more than personal. These 3 themes are interconnected. As the stories I have shared today suggest, the material, emotional, and relational are bound up with one another in the liturgical experience of occasional participants. The experiences and insights that occasional practitioners provide regarding the material, emotional, and relational dimensions of worship push back on common tendencies among routine practitioners and clergy, and especially liturgical theologians, to examine worship primarily as linguistic, conceptual, and individual. Occasional religious practice is an opportunity for expanding this vision. A common concern expressed in interviews with clergy is ensuring that occasional practice has, quote, integrity. Intriguingly, the word integrity is used in 10 of the 20 interviews with clergy, but is not mentioned by a single one of the 41 participants. Maintaining integrity, at least in this language, appears to be the concern of clergy, not occasional practitioners. Participants are not afraid that their integrity or the integrity of the practice will be compromised. Clergy, however, do have these anxieties, as do some routine practitioners. If you find yourself in this space, I encourage you to reflect on what is behind it. What are you protecting? What are you afraid of? What do you aspire to? I hope that better understanding the diversity and depth of vocational practice can establish a more honest and complete framework for reflecting on questions of integrity. When I think of integrity, I think of some of the clergy who are essential collaborators in this research. These priests welcomed me into their communities and facilitated connections with participants. With profound integrity, they think deeply, pastorally, and theologically about occasional practice. One of them describes his approach in this way: "My personal belief is that it is a ministry. We don't know what the Holy Spirit is doing behind the scenes." We do not know what the Spirit is doing behind the scenes in the lives of occasional practitioners, or any of us for that matter. However, this research reveals that there is much we can know, as well as a lot more to discover about the role of occasional religious practice in the lives of individuals, in local congregations, and in the contemporary religious landscape, if we are willing to listen. I have the tremendous privilege of listening to occasional practitioners, as well as routine practitioners and clergy, as a social scientist and theologian. I had the opportunity to hear the stories of Maureen, Danielle, and Dora, of Catherine and John and Greta, and many others. You also have the opportunity to listen as parents and partners, pastors and teachers, and friends. Over a cup of tea at a busy Starbucks, over a cup of coffee in a church hall, over Christmas Eve dinner, or at a baptism celebration, you have the opportunity to listen. Occasional religious practice is not hard to find. So let's start paying attention and learning from one another as people who relate to religion in different ways.
Thank you, Sarah. A lot to ponder. I'm sure there's questions here. Sarah, you're willing to answer some questions. Do you want to field them as well as the questions come in? And I'll keep an eye on the virtual questions. Well, they're actually real questions. I keep forgetting that. They come in virtually. They are real questions. But Sarah, I'll let you then manage those questions. There's a lot. I have a few.
And I believe there's a microphone over here, so those who are online can hear if you have a question in the room.
Could I start us off on the microphone over here then? I really do have a bunch of questions. I was in some way surprised to assume that occasional practitioners are in crisis. And would that just, well, first, would you mind unpacking that a bit more? And could you also say, is this the case for clergy, or is this the case for people who encounter occasional practitioners as well? Like, how would you deal with that sort of on a one-to-one basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I'd say crisis ranges a lot in terms of what it involves here. But I'm thinking especially, each of these interviews started with a baptism or funeral as the starting point, and then spiraled into many other topics from there, many other experiences. And one of the common threads that ran through many of these conversations is that these are significant moments, especially the life transition practices, baptisms, funerals, weddings. They may be very joyful times, but they're also complicated in terms of family relationships. They're complicated in terms of how different people relate to religion. Sometimes there's a lot of tension going into these moments. Sometimes there's this type of crisis happening in the background that's just not visible. It looks like a regular wedding, or it looks like a regular baptism, or it looks like a regular funeral. But then when I am in conversation and hear the bigger story, there's something else that's happening there that makes what may at first seem like an event that's very standard for clergy. We do these things all the time, but that is really a significant moment and a complex moment in the lives of participants. So to be aware of that, and I think it probably is more mild on an occasion like Christmas Eve, yes, but that can still carry that kind of tension. These are in religious ritual, we're hoping in some ways that these things do come to the surface, that they express core parts of our identities, that they connect with our lives in really significant ways. So we can expect that to happen in those moments for all participants. Mm-hmm.
This was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for talking to us on this topic. This is perhaps a bit facetious. Which denomination is doing better with occasional practitioners? And I noticed you didn't tell us what church Greta got married in.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for that question. And I need to be very clear that this research is based only in the Anglican tradition, only in Toronto. So I can't speak comparatively beyond that context. So Greta did get married in an Anglican church. The baptism of one of her children was the starting point for our conversation. That being said, I spoke with many Roman Catholics in the process of conducting this research. Definitely the second largest group next to people who would identify in some sense as Anglican. And there are many ways to think about why that's the case. I'm speaking with them about Anglican practices. So for some reason they have chosen not to participate in this practice in the Catholic context. And there are many different reasons for that. A couple of those came up in stories that I shared tonight, whether it was particular barriers to access. Sometimes it's a sense of theological difference. Looking for maybe a more progressive space is something that does prompt that kind of switching on these occasions. Often the participants who have a Roman Catholic background continue to identify as Catholic, even if they're choosing to participate in Anglican traditions for these occasions. I think the ritual similarity between the Anglican and Catholic traditions is also really important for understanding this, and that there are these really significant overlaps in terms of the sorts of material and aesthetic dimensions of the rituals that really matter to occasional practitioners. So there is this sense of familiarity in the ways that are necessary for it to really feel like a baptism or feel like a funeral, but there's also difference in ways that create space for those who might not find a home in those practices in the Catholic tradition. So I will admit in this research, the Catholic Church does not come out looking very good on these things, but I'm also only talking to Anglicans who have made the choice to practice in the Anglican tradition. So, or I've only people who identify in many ways but have chosen Anglican ritual. So I think it would be fascinating to do a comparative study with occasional practitioners who've chosen to stay in the Catholic Church and see how they experience that differently or in similar ways to those who are participating in Anglican practices.
We do have a comment and a question from online. Comment, thank you for these compassionate insights. For those of us who are intensive practitioners, who have children who are occasional practitioners, what grace your insights have provided to see each of the occasions as opportunities. Aha. And your comments about the work of the Holy Spirit are incredibly inspiring for us. So that was two people who had sent in that comment.
Well, thank you for that comment. And I'm multi-generational families are very much on my mind in this research. One of the things we know about the Canadian religious landscape is that religious change is happening in ways that are generational. So each generation is less religious than the generations before in terms of measures of attendance, of affiliation, and of belief. So there are often these differences that are within family structures in terms of how people relate to religion. And I do have those families in mind when doing this research and reflecting on it. I would, as part of that too, these are our occasions that bring families together. And one of the really interesting things about this study has been being able to speak with members of those different generations. In some cases, I'm able to speak with 2 or 3 generations of the same family and hear those differences that we see in the more sort of quantitative data playing out within the families who I speak with, as I'm sure those of you who work with families in preparation for these process or as clergy also see those generational differences. So thank you for that comment.
I don't want to cut off questions here, but we do have one more from online.
I think.
And so I'll get to that, Father Rob, before the stories you've told us about focus on worship participation as occasional religious practice, I'm curious about whether giving, in particular giving money to a church, have been explored by you or others, and whether this is tied to worship participation in the research you have done.
Yeah, so a question about giving as it relates to occasional practice. So I'm not an expert on religious philanthropy. There are lots of people who do that research. But I will say one of the really interesting things about the Anglican Diocese of Toronto is that there are many more givers than routine attenders in many parishes. So there is not necessarily a tight correlation between routine attendance and giving. So there are occasional practitioners who are financially generous, and I've spoken with a few of those as well, especially the pandemic was beginning right when I was wrapping up interviews, and I spoke with a couple of vocational practitioners who said, well, I don't participate regularly, but when I knew this crisis was coming and the church would be suffering, I sent them a check. So there isn't necessarily a clear link, but I don't have the kind of data to back that up in detail. It's a good question to ask. It would be good to do more work with that too.
So this question actually dovetails with how you just finished there. What's your sense about what this break that COVID has caused, where people haven't been able to worship regularly or occasionally in many places? Do you have a sense of where this is likely to go as people are now allowed to come back?
Mm-hmm. Such an interesting question. And there's a lot of research happening right now on the impact of the pandemic on religious communities. And I feel like we're still in the midst of this. It's still unfolding. We don't yet know the results even of that early research. This study that I've been working on, it really is pre-pandemic. The pandemic in many ways brought to an end the project. So I can't really speak to it out of this data in particular, but I will note a few things. One is that the pandemic has revealed that moving worship online has allowed some people who may have been involuntary occasional practitioners to participate more routinely. And we can see that especially with people who are maybe at a distance from their congregation, those who rely on others for transportation. That there's a more routine participation from those who are involuntarily occasional when multiple formats are available. But in terms of the long-term effects, I think that's very uncertain right now.
Could you comment on something that I've noticed is that, say, a year ago, after we had experienced a certain period of separation because of the pandemic, people were saying, I didn't miss it as much as I thought I would. And then moving a little longer, people started to have the opportunity to come back, and they came back with a real assertiveness, saying, I know there was something missing, and now I'm back with a new intentionality. So just interested to hear how you respond to that experience that I'm hearing right now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation to make. And I'm curious how that is similar or different across different communities and traditions too. I am curious especially how the pandemic will impact that religious middle. Because that seems like there are those who are firmly religious who will probably come back. There are those who are non-religious who will probably stay disconnected. But I think that middle ground is one of the parts of one of the ways of relating to religion that is kind of in flux already, that has a natural kind of flexibility to it, or that has sort of a more ambiguity around it, and that this experience maybe will shift that in some unexpected ways. But one of the nice things about sociology is that we're not really in the business of predicting the future. We look at the past and explain trends rather than predicting what will come next. So I think we will all have to wait and see how the pandemic impacts Christian worship and occasional practice.
I have a comment, if I can read while you're another comment from online. As cradle Catholics, we've been discouraged from shopping around, but from your research, one can see the good results that can come from this persistence. So I'm not sure the context for that, but maybe the the way in which people still found a place where they felt comfortable.
Yes, yeah, I think persistence is a good word. That persistence is present in many of the stories of vocational practitioners who I speak with, especially those who didn't end up in the place they thought would be their default starting point. And to me, it really is a testament to their commitment to occasional practice, to reach out not only to the obvious choice, the family church, the local parish, but then to seek out another one, and then to switch traditions, and then seek out another tradition, another congregation within that tradition. These types of stories show that level of commitment, that these practices really matter to occasional practitioners. If they weren't committed, they would not have asked 4 or 5 congregations before reaching a place where they could engage in the practice. Mm-hmm.
Great presentation, Sarah. Kind of a comment, and then I don't know if you want to comment on it yourself. As a Roman Catholic myself, just thinking about the global sort of synodal process we're about to begin, and I'm just struck by, I mean, this sort of begun already, including globally, and I'm just struck by how there are so many people that we're not reaching because of the way in which we sort of think about, Catholics as being committed. The people that we're going to reach out to are those who are coming on a weekly basis, and I'm just struck by how I really appreciate the way in which you spoke about, sort of a shift in attitudes that's required to sort of embrace and to sort of listen to and learn from those who are occasional religious practitioners. And I'm just struck how meaningful that is for Roman Catholics, I think, in the global sort of process that we're just beginning now. And I just wanted to thank you for that, because I think that's allowed me to think about all of this in a really interesting sort of way. If you want to comment, comment. If not, I just tell you that it was a great presentation.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, thinking about how to engage occasional practitioners in a church process like that is a really interesting and challenging question. One of the things that I found really helpful in terms of connecting with occasional practitioners was finding the common ground. And one of the wonderful things about having a baptism or a funeral be a starting point is that this is an event that occasional practitioners were very invested in themselves. That the parents for whom the baptism was their only point of connection with an Anglican church, never attended another service there, just that one baptism, would meet with me to speak about it because it was the baptism of their child and it meant so much for them. So we had this common ground that could serve as a starting point for conversation. So I wonder what that common ground might be in these sorts of broader processes. Where can we find the starting point for a conversation?
Any final questions? If not, will you join me in thanking Sarah Johnson? This is incredibly relevant for the work we're starting to do at the Center for Christian Engagement. I thank you for that. I should let you know here and folks online that the lecture will appear on the St. Mark's College YouTube channel, where you can already find Dr. Michael Higgins' October 1st lecture and Gabrielle Earnshaw's October 16th lecture as well. I also want to thank all of my colleagues at St. Mark's College, Corpus Christi College, and the parish of St. Mark's who allow this sort of event to take place. Any of you who are listening today or who are here today, contact me with any questions. If there's anything you want to discuss regarding the lecture tonight, any ideas that have been stoked for you, or to suggest other programming, or just to talk, you can contact me at jmartens, M-A-R-T-E-N-S, at stmarkscollege.ca. For those of you who are here with us in person, please feel free to join us for Christmas cookies and Christmas treats that are available just outside the venue in Plato's Cave. I think they're really delicious. All of the treats are nut-free. And please stay and join us and talk with Sarah if you have the time, and if she has the time. And let's one more time thank her for this lecture.